No lies, no distortions, just the facts and the truth about issues that matter. Facts First with Christian Esguerra.
Good evening, I'm Christian Esguerra. Welcome to tonight's episode of Facts First. This is a 3 times a week program that we have. Usually we do code switching on this program, but for tonight we're going to speak in straight English because our very special guest for tonight is someone very knowledgeable about the problem of disinformation, which is our topic for today. He is a Frenchman, and still, if you have questions for him, because the problem of disinformation is very pervasive, and I suppose based on your reactions after we launched or posted the publicity materials about this particular episode, a lot of people engaged already. Many comments were posted as well as questions, but keep those questions and comments coming during the program. We devoted the entire program for this particular topic of disinformation and how bad disinformation has become here in the Philippines, especially in light of the recent election campaign, the May 9, 2022 elections. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest for tonight. He is the Chief of Party of the Initiative for Media Freedom. He is also the Country Director of Internews. I'd like to introduce to you and welcome to our program, Mr. Greg Kealia. Good evening, Greg. Thank you for
Good
joining
evening,
us
Christian.
tonight.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.
Okay. Greg and I think we've been part of at least a couple of forums in the past month, right? The
Definitely.
topic was often about disinformation and how to combat it. Now, I decided to invite Greg for tonight's episode because he has a lot of data that he can share with us, which he had shared during those forums that I mentioned to you. And I think this would be useful for those who would like to be familiar about the problem of disinformation here in the Philippines. But before that, perhaps you can give our audience an idea of what Internews and the Initiative for Media Freedom is all about, Greg.
Thanks, Christian. So Internews is an NGO. It's an international nonprofit. We are active in around 100 countries, partners across the globe. And really our raison d'etre, our main purpose is to support independent media and more generally to support healthy information ecosystem in our partner countries. And when it comes to the Initiative for Media Freedom, which is the main program implemented by Internews in the Philippines, it is a program supported by USAID, which is essentially focusing on 3 objectives. The first one is to defend and protect media freedom, which include media safety, an important issue in the Philippine context. The second one is about disinformation, indeed, and I'll explain probably a bit later how we approach this question. And the third objective is to work on self-regulation of the Philippine media sector.
Okay, so let's go straight to the point. So, your group, in particular Internews, has been conducting or tapping other experts to help you in this research about disinformation. Let's talk about the problem of disinformation in the Philippines today as we speak. How bad has it become?
As you know, Christian, the Philippines is really one of the first countries where the potential of destabilization of disinformation for political processes in general, for elections in particular, was noticed back in 2016. There is this famous quote of a Facebook executive commenting on 2016 presidential election, describing the Philippines as the patient zero of the war on disinformation. We know that a toxic actor like the company Cambridge Analytica, which was deeply involved in misuse of data harvested by Facebook, the whistleblower of that company referred to the Philippines as the petri dish for his company. So the Philippines has been a testing ground for disinformation operators for unfortunately quite a long time. Did it get better or worse? What data tend to show, if you observe the evolution of disinformation patterns between 2016 election, 2019 midterm elections, and then 2022 elections, the indication is that disinformation is spreading horizontally between political groups, between stakeholders in general, spreading vertically between various levels of elections, from the national to the barangay level elections. It's also another characteristic of the Philippine disinformation landscape is also the incredible diversity of types of disinformation, because disinformation is a very broad concept, right? You can be talking about organic disinformation, political supporters spreading disinformation, thinking it helps their candidate. You can be talking about professionalized disinformation operators contracted by politicians or by other forces. You can be talking about foreign influences. In the Philippine context, we have a bit all of this. So that makes it a very interesting case study, but also a very difficult case study when it comes to tackling, to combating disinformation.
Okay. Aside from the diversity that you mentioned, what else is with the Philippines that made it the so-called patient zero in this disinformation war, the so-called petri dish, or as you put it, the testing ground? Why us?
There are really various possible explanations, and it's probably a combination of a bit all of those. One of them is definitely the internet penetration and the prevalence of social media. We're talking in the Philippines about an average of 11 hours a day spent on the internet by Filipino users, which is the longest time worldwide. We're talking about over 4 hours and 15 minutes spent on social media every day. Here again, the longest time worldwide and twice the global average. So this huge prevalence of both internet and social media certainly plays a role. I will say, I will advance the hypothesis that the fact the Philippines is an English-speaking country also play a role, particularly for professionalized disinformation operators who want to test their method. It's an easy ground because people speak English, right? And then I would say there are other aspects which make these information operations particularly attractive for operators here. One is related to the weaknesses of the political model of the Philippines. The Philippines is one of the very few democracies in Southeast Asia, but it has some vulnerabilities. And one of these vulnerabilities is definitely the dynastic and clientelist dimension of the Philippine democracy, which means that elections are very much personality driven, which means that disinformation works particularly well. And then I will add maybe a last possible explanation, which is of course the geopolitical position of the Philippines, its maritime position, which make it an attractive target for foreign.
I think there are also scholars before who mentioned the idea that the Philippines was considered as patient zero in this disinformation campaign, and that the operations or the lessons that were learned from the experience here in the Philippines actually imported, right, or exported. How true is that?
Oh, two, sorry.
Yeah, how true is that? That the operations that were conducted here in the Philippines were actually exported in other countries.
What I can what I can tell you is at our humble level as an NGO, certainly we are learning a lot from the experience of Philippine organizations, civil society organizations, media, obviously, academic organizations. There are quality and a quantity of research and effort against disinformation in the Philippines, which is unlike anything I have seen anywhere else. And we do use the Philippine experience in our organization, Internews, to inform the design of programs in other countries. I was recently talking to a few friends, journalists in France, about the issue of disinformation, and there was quite a consensus that there is a lot to learn, including for European operators, from the Philippine experience. Absolutely.
Now, the fact that Facebook was also made free in the Philippines, was that, how big a factor was that?
Well, that certainly contributed to the prevalence of social media. If you look at Filipino internet users, or Filipino social media, internet users, yes, that's correct. The ownership of a Facebook account is quasi universal. 99% of Filipinos who are on the internet have a Facebook account. And as we mentioned earlier, the social media prevalence fueling obviously the potential of disinformation of the social media platforms. It played a role in making the Philippines tempting ground, a tempting testing lab for disinformation operators. Yeah.
But is there also something unique about the Philippine experience compared to, let's say, how disinformation campaigns are run in other countries, in other territories?
I'll say really, in my view, I don't know if academic researchers will agree with me on this, but in my view, what is really characterizing the Philippines is not something which is necessarily unique. It's the scale and the volume. Or if you want to put it in another way, is the fact that factors which exist in various other environments are all converging here in one single country. I mentioned earlier the diversity of operators, of disinformation operators, domestic, foreign, private, public. Um, I mentioned the spread of disinformation between various levels of elections, between various political groups, the importance in the social media landscape here of micro influencers and influencers in general, which have become a very important issue, very important vector of disinformation. And of course, the prevalence in the Philippines of issues which are not directly related to disinformation, but are both worsened by it and worsening it, such as the question of safety of journalists. All that makes it. So it's a big mix of factors which makes the Philippines quite a unique case for people studying and working on disinformation.
Okay, so what's unique with the Philippines is the scale and the volume of disinformation, as mentioned by Greg. But how about the fact that there are certain state actors that are also involved in the propagation of disinformation? How big
That's
is that a factor in the Philippines?
that's not unique to the Philippines, but that's definitely one of the elements of the diversity of operators I mentioned. The involvement of public figures in this information campaign, and more generally on what we call digital, the question of digital safety, right? I mean, then if you look at the past election cycle or the ongoing election cycle, since we are in the post-election phase, there is another characteristic which relate to the digital aspects of election, which is not disinformation but cyber attacks. And when it comes to cyber attacks, you have exactly the same diversity of operators. You have cyber attacks which forensic organizations have been able to attribute to private operators, private hacking groups, but you have cyber attacks which have been connected to IP address related to public institutions. So both for disinformation and cyber attacks, we notice the involvement of private operators, of public operators, of Filipino operators, and of foreign operators.
But for example, in the Philippines, does Internews have any data or any idea of how pervasive this involvement of certain government officials, personalities, or state actors in the spread of disinformation?
We do not have detailed data on this because that require a level of forensic approach of this information, which require technical means which are out of the scope of what we can directly do. Um, what we are interested to monitor though is the use of this information by public figures. Um, Whether or not they were at the origin of this information, it's very interesting to monitor the way those disinformation campaigns can be repeated, can be amplified by public figure. I take just one example during this election. There was this very problematic page, XSOX, which was spreading disinformation related to the electoral process, presenting forged documents as if they were leaked from the Smartmatic and the Comelec servers. It even eventually led to some arrest by the NBI, by the PNP. That page, that specific page, was quoted by a senator, Senator Jaime Marcos, during a session at the Congress as somehow a proof or a source or a valid source of information indicating that there was a problem of fraud being planned, being organized, orchestrated by the Comelec. So that's a very concrete example of a disinformation online in a relatively limited group. I think that group XSOX had by the end of January around 16,000 followers, but which gained considerable momentum, being amplified, being made public, being legitimized by a public figure.
And of course, as a senator, Senator Amy Marcos is also the chairperson of the Senate Committee on Electoral Reforms, right? So that in itself puts more weight in her credibility or the lack of it, depending on how you look at it. I'm going to read a comment coming from one of my former students. His name is George De La Rama. His question is, how come other countries are able to fight disinformation and were able to elect progressive leaders, but the Philippines can't? I think this includes a lot of assumptions, right? Perhaps you can answer a related question first. Are there any country? Is there any country that is doing better in terms of fighting disinformation? And then we go straight to the question of George.
I think there are interesting elements to look into in all countries, but what is clear, absolutely clear at this stage, is nobody has found the silver bullet against disinformation. Everyone is testing. Everyone is constantly trying to reinvent their approach and their model, because this is what disinformation operators themselves are doing. They are constantly testing the system, constantly finding new way to undermine democratic models and the societies they are targeting. And therefore, I do not know if there are countries which are doing better, because it's difficult to assess what does not happen, right? But what is certain is, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of excellent elements of reflection, excellent models, excellent experiences in the Philippine environment from which we can learn for the sake of the Philippines and for the sake of other countries too. Absolutely.
The other question is, for example, during the recent elections here in the Philippines, do you have any idea of how bad the disinformation campaign was?
What we notice, both, so in Internews, we had a modest social media monitoring mechanism we deployed
Correct.
in December, a few months before the elections. Um, and we observe the evolution of the trends of disinformation on all social media, human monitors. And I cannot emphasize enough how it is important everywhere in every country to have human monitors observing those processes to understand the dynamic and the trends behind those disinformation operations. And be it if you do that on short term, as we did since December, or if you do that on longer term, as excellent researchers like Nicole Curato, Jonathan Ong have been doing since 2016, the pattern is clear. The disinformation is spreading. The phenomenon of disinformation is not under control. This is a prevalent feature in all political processes in the Philippines and in electoral processes in particular. We saw the percentage of election-focused disinformation evolving rapidly, exponentially from one month to another in the last 4 or 5 months before the election. We were observing all disinformation, not only election disinformation. And the percentage of disinformation posts and pages which were related to elections exploded literally in the months prior to the election. So there is certainly an increasingly routine use of disinformation campaign in Philippine politics, as in all democracies here again.
Yeah. Although technically disinformation campaigns are nothing new when it comes to election campaigns, but I think the tools, the platforms, the techniques, and the strategies, and the scale, and gravity and impact as well. Those are the things that we have to look at, right?
You're absolutely correct, Christian. And I think that's something we always need to have in mind. Disinformation is organically part of political life, organically part of elections too, has existed as long as people have been trying to convince other people to vote for them or to choose them as a leader or as a chief. What is new is the amplification. Is the reach of disinformation campaign, and a key factor of explanation there is obviously social media. Today, through a disinformation campaign, you can not only ensure to reach millions of people, while you will reach probably a few hundred without social media, but you can also make an audience captive with that phenomenon of information bubble, of echo chamber. You can make sure that people who are already convinced will be increasingly more convinced and will have less and less access to alternative sources of information, which of course strengthen the phenomenon, worsen the phenomenon of polarization, which is also one of the features of the Philippine political landscape. Here again, not unlike other democracies, but yeah.
Okay. So, in a while, we're going to talk specifically about the platforms that have been that are being used to spread disinformation, basically to spread lies. But first off, I'd like to ask you this basic question, and personally, this is a very troubling question to ask. Are we losing the disinformation war here in the Philippines?
Um, I don't think so. I don't think it's time to decide who has won and who has lost this war. The notion of war on disinformation is highly contested and disputed in my field of work. Some people feel that the warlike terminology is not appropriate. There are different opinions on this, and I won't enter that debate. But I do believe we are attending a great battle for democracy of the scale that we have seen in the 30s and 40s, in the 1940s, 30s and 1940s in Europe, with the rise of fascism. That's the kind of threat we are talking about, something which is a vital threat for the democratic model. We have a lot to lose if that war, if it's a war or not, is lost. So that's a priority in my view, but it's too early to say it has been won or it has been lost. It is definitely the moment to reflect on what works and what doesn't, and to see how we can do better, and to anticipate or to base our strategies on the fact that we need to work both on short term, because if we don't work on short term, there won't be a long term for democracy. If all democracies worldwide fall in the hand of populist authoritarian leaders, there won't be a second chance. So on short term, we need to indeed contain as much as we can this terrible phenomenon, but we also need to reflect deeply on the long term, and how to better equip citizens of our countries to resist the temptation of disinformation.
Okay, there's a question for you here, Greg. Aren't your team afraid of the possible actions that the incoming administration might do to NGOs such as yours?
We are a duly registered organization in the Philippines. We comply with all the requirements of the Philippine law. Internews work in complex environments, some of them much more risky for NGOs than the Philippines are. War-torn countries, countries with failed state. In the Philippines, we have been able to operate and implement our programs without issue to date, and we hope that to continue.
Aren't you being too optimistic, or is there really some sort of fear or pressure that you're feeling somehow? Because you're
No,
talking about disinformation, which is a very big problem here.
no, but that's the thing, right? I think I do not want to be a vector of disinformation myself by expressing more concerns than we have been given reason to express to date. If we are targeted by hostile action, I will be the first one to say it, but we haven't so far, in all fairness, and we genuinely hope to continue. I think one key aspect for any NGO country director, for any organization, internews or another in any country, one key aspect of our jobs is to make sure that we fully comply with legal requirements, so because we don't give any pretext for legal harassment, for lawfare against our organization, and that we will continue to ensure that we are fully compliant with all aspects of the Philippine law. And for the rest, I mean, if we are targeted by hostile campaigns, we will act on that moment. But at this stage, everything's okay. Thank you for the concerns. I appreciate it.
So far, so good. And by the way, I think you were stationed in Myanmar, right?
I
So
was in Myanmar before being in the Philippines, correct? Yeah.
you were in Myanmar, so you're not used to challenges, to say the least.
Voila.
Okay, voila. Okay. Now, how about this? Give us an idea of as to whether of how big a factor was the disinformation campaign was in the outcome of the recent elections here in the Philippines. Do you have any somehow data related to that? Because I think there's a common question people have been asking that perhaps our choices, especially for the national positions, might have been affected heavily by a lot of disinformation campaigns over the years.
Look, I think very honestly, it's virtually impossible to say. And I will even say that any analyst, any NGO who will claim they know the answer to that question, be it in the Philippines or elsewhere, will probably be presenting assumptions as facts because we do not know. We do not know how people form their opinion. It's extremely complex, and it's probably a combination of various factors. Was there disinformation in these elections? Absolutely. Did we notice that disinformation campaigns were implemented to whitewash some part of the past of Philippine history, such as the martial law? Absolutely. Could that contribute to the change of perception of the voters for one brand versus another brand, if I can qualify as that, the candidates in these elections? Probably. But were they other factors in these Philippine elections or other democratic elections affected by disinformation across the globe recently? Absolutely too. We know, for example, that the grotesque economic inequalities affecting societies like the Philippines and other democratic societies play a role in that frustration of voters and what some people have called the revenge vote. Voting for what seems to be the most radical change, voting to what seems to be the greatest punishment for what is the perceived elite. All those factors play a role. I think it's fair to assume in disinformation play a major role nowadays in the way the public opinion are formed in democracies, but it's impossible to quantify.
Okay, let's go to the specific platforms that have been that are being used to spread lies or disinformation. For example, we have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have TikTok. Right? Talk to us about the specific advantages or unique qualities or features that somehow make each of those platforms more very useful for people who would like to spread lies. For example, Facebook.
Well, I think there are common patterns between various platforms when it comes to disinformation, and what we see a lot in 2022 is disinformation campaign using multi-platformed approach. So starting on one social media, for example, Facebook, and then being amplified on TikTok, on Twitter, on YouTube. What we do notice certainly is the rise of video as a support for disinformation. And it has at least two possible explanations. One is it is attractive to the consumers of information and disinformation, but also it is much more difficult to monitor. There are hundreds of ways to hide disinformation in an otherwise perfectly acceptable video, which will fall, which will really pass the screening of algorithm and not be detected. So we see a lot of video-based disinformation, more and more of it. We saw the evolution really on a monthly basis in the pre-electoral period, and some platforms are better equipped for video support than others. TikTok has seen a major rise of disinformation for this election, for example. But in general, what we see is the same disinformation operators, notably the largest one, are present on all social media, have accounts on all social media, and adapt their messages to the various platforms and support.
But are they equal in significance? I mean, the platforms that are used for this information, or for example, TikTok has become the main battleground for this information, so to speak. Has it taken over, for example, YouTube or Facebook?
In terms of users, no. Facebook remain the main platform in the Philippines. YouTube is getting close. TikTok has been the most downloaded platform in the Philippines in 2020, but has not reached the same number of users yet. What I think is interesting to observe is the way the platforms seem to have taken some lessons from 2016 elections. We have seen much more proactive policies from the platform in 2022 Is that enough? Certainly not, but much more than in 2016, much more awareness, much more action from the platform, partnership with news organizations, partnership with INGOs like Internews. I can take also the example of the decision of Google and therefore YouTube to suspend political ads ahead of Philippine elections, decision taken in December. So they are trying to do a better job, I would say. And on this, the biggest platform have been leading, and the less used platforms are following, but essentially following the same models, trying to build partnership with civil society and Philippine media organizations.
Okay. You mentioned the more prevalent use of videos for disinformation. Can you cite examples of how somehow a seemingly innocuous video can be used for disinformation? Are we talking here of, let's say, simple videos about instructions on how to cook or how to improve your hair on a bad hair day,
Yeah.
for example, and then in the middle
It
of
can
the presentation you can insert certain political content? Is that it?
It can absolutely be that. It can absolutely be that. And actually, what you're describing is not only true at the level of the disinformation video, the disinformation post. It's true at the level of the page or of the disinformation profile. In several instances, pages which have been created for completely non-political purpose. Mom and pop blog. It can be a cooking blog. It can be a sport coach. Suddenly shifting, using their influence, their reach. To support a candidate. And I'll come back to this. But to reply your question specifically on how you can hide disinformation in a video, there are actually technical ways to avoid detection by algorithm, using background music, playing the video a bit faster. But there is also one way which is extremely difficult to to contain because it's really at the limit of disinformation. It's the use of emotions. Video which won't necessarily have a clearly stated political message, but by the combination of certain images and certain music, for example, will generate an emotion around a political figure or an historical figure, which de facto make them part of the political campaign, even if there is nothing which will allow to directly consider that as falling under a campaign strategy. So
Okay, you
that's
mentioned
another. Go ahead.
okay.
Sorry.
So it's very difficult really to detect here. So basically, it's getting worse and worse as days go by, and I'm not sure whether we're equipped with enough tools or wherewithal to actually deal with this. We're going to talk about the solutions toward the end of this discussion. But let me ask first about algorithms. Basically, is there any difference when it comes to algorithms on Facebook, YouTube, or TikTok? In such a way that they can create more and more echo chambers and manipulate attitudes and what people basically see online.
I wouldn't be able to go into technical details here, but we know that some platforms, Facebook notably, have been exploring way to burst a little bit the information bubble and expose the followers to more diverse information in their feed. Um, One aspect I would like to mention, so also continuing on your previous question, is the question of monetization. And that's for me one of the most alarming questions. Because concretely, nowadays, if you are a page, a brand, let's say a sport coach, and you want to boost your number of followers, to monetize your page, to have more income or revenue from your page, you can essentially make an alliance. And it doesn't even need to be discussed or stated. You can just endorse one candidate to bring the followers of that candidate to your page and make your page, the monetization of your page easier. And it can be done completely organically, which means there is no contract, there is no even need for any discussion between the political campaign strategist or the political candidate and that bloggers or that owner of a Facebook profile. It's just mutually beneficial. And it does not even fall under campaign finance regulation. It's not accounted for. It is campaigning, but it's not accounted for as campaign finance expenditures. That is for me one clear indication that we will need inevitably a deep, profound reflection involving social media platforms and some sort of common regulation of social media platforms, so that they agree on some standard to contain that phenomenon. Because That is virtually impossible for electoral commissions to monitor that alone in the Philippines or elsewhere, be it the COMELEC or any other electoral commission in the world, cannot embrace the rise of influencers as political stakeholders.
Yeah, actually, I didn't realize the monetization aspect for certain influencers uh, was that big a factor in terms of spreading disinformation until you put it that way. I
Yes,
hope our viewers
absolutely.
realize how big the problem is, right? So basically, someone who has a YouTube channel, for example, or a TikTok account, if he or she wants more followers, basically the politician, the candidate, the purveyor of disinformation can bring in those followers, and he would benefit because of the views, right? And then in the
Both sides will
process, he would
benefit.
just have did it.
Absolutely, both side will benefit. And to answer your question, yes, we clearly attending a rise of micro influencers and influencers in general in the disinformation landscape. That's a pattern which was already noticeable comparing 2019 midterm elections to 2016 presidential elections. There's an excellent paper of Nicole Curato and Jonathan Ong on this. This phenomenon is even more obvious in 2022. And again, I do not think that will be specific to the Philippines. I think studies in other countries, in upcoming elections, in other democracies, will show the same trend. Internews is about to start a new large research project with a team of Filipino researchers, which will be entirely dedicated to understanding the political economy of the influencer community and how they play a role in the disinformation landscape. So if we talk again in 1 year, I will have much more precise data on this. But absolutely, the rise of influencers is very, very noticeable in the disinformation landscape already.
Okay. Now, speaking of influencers, I understand based on studies conducted in 2016 about the 2016 elections, I think they were at that time they were talking of celebrity influencers, the big ones, those with big followers, and then later on the focus was on the so-called micro influencers. Talk to
Correct.
us about the difference in terms of impact. I think the micro influencers were more pronounced in the 2019 elections, right? Basically, when you say micro influencers, how are we talking here of a follower of a number of followers, let's say 1,000 or fewer? I mean, what do you mean by micro influencers?
Could be 1,000, could be 10,000. Really, it's really a very broad concept. But yes, we are essentially talking about much more granular disinformation operations using much smaller influencers with smaller communities. That means um, messages much more adapted to a specific audience. Um, Essentially, if you, and that's again something which was probably first noticed in the Philippines, which I do not think is specific to the Philippines. If you look at the pattern of evolution of who are the disinformation operators from 2016 to 2022, we are moving from large PR firms which contract for what is presented as a political strategy and political campaign developments, which are conducted disinformation operations for contract, which can be in the probably in six figures in USD, in US dollars contract. When we shift to micro influencers, we're talking about people which either are not paid at all because of monetization or can be paid $50, $100, but hundreds of them, possibly thousands of them, with again much more granular messages and much more widespread reach, and also making the work for organizations involved in trying to track and identify and name disinformation operators like Internews much more difficult because we have to deal with thousands of operators instead of just a few.
You don't have, in terms of exacting accountability, there are a lot of people to go after, right? How about, Viber is very popular in the Philippines, and we know that Viber or chat groups are also being used to spread disinformation.
That is
As I
correct, and
see it,
that is
yeah, go
sorry.
ahead, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, no, please go ahead,
No, no,
Christian. Sorry,
okay.
I was
No,
going to
as
say
I
that
see
is.
it, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
You go first.
Okay, okay. I mean, Viber is very popular in the Philippines, although not necessarily as popular in other countries. Or in other countries, they're not exactly as popular as Viber is in the Philippines. But I mean, the credibility of certain members of a Viber group can also add to the spread of disinformation, right? For example, you have an alumni group, graduates of a particular school, and then someone they look up to uh, shared a piece of disinformation in that Viber group, that can also spread, right? And then the credibility of that person to that particular group can add to the credibility of the disinformation, right? I mean, what kind of problem are we seeing here in terms of
I think you're
private
talking
messages?
about a very specific. I feel you have a specific example in mind. Now you're making me curious. But yes, you're right. You're right. Wall gardens, messaging apps are one of the front line of the work of disinformation. We need to do much more and much better on this. It's much more difficult to access, obviously, for the obvious reason that what those apps are selling are secured, encrypted information. It's not public. But we know, and there are clear data showing that messaging apps like WhatsApp have played a considerable role in spreading disinformation in some elections. India is one example, to the extent that, if my memory is correct, WhatsApp had to take specific measures in India by limiting the number of time a message could be shared, to avoid the misuse of their services for this information. So that's definitely another type of platforms on which we need to do much more and much better. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about solutions. Okay, very
Yeah.
specifically, usually a lot of people see the effort of news organizations, together with the academe and other members of civil society, in terms of addressing the problem of disinformation through fact checking. Honestly, is it working, and is it enough?
That's a good question, and that's a difficult one. As I mentioned earlier, there is no silver bullet against disinformation, and fact checking is not a silver bullet either. Do I believe fact checking is necessary? Absolutely. Well, first, there is a key principle we need to really have in mind here. The whole principle of disinformation is to undermine the very notion of truth. Is to build this kind of post-truth world some authoritarian leaders have been dreaming about. And fact checkers have a frontliner role in keeping truth alive, in keeping the notion of truth and the notion of data-driven truth or fact-based truth alive. Furthermore, because there were so many questions about whether fact checking was working or if fact checkers were only talking to an echo chamber, there have been some recent studies, recent international studies looking at the efficiency of fact checking. And those studies confirm that on communities exposed to fact checking compared to communities which were not exposed to fact checking was playing a role in spreading, in slowing down actually the role of disinformation in a relatively minor way, confirming that it is not enough, but nevertheless was contributing to slow down the spread of disinformation. Now, when you look at those data, you need to look at those data having in mind another set of data, which was that study some years ago, which tried to measure the pace of spread of an information on social media and found out that lies were spreading, I believe, 6 times faster than facts on social media. That makes the volume and the speed of disinformation fact checkers have to deal with obviously absolutely impossible to tackle by fact checking only. But we do need fact checking. I'm absolutely convinced about that. In my view, that's one part of a very large toolbox we need to, and I'm happy to tell you more about some of the tools we implement here in the Philippines, we use here in the Philippines. But fact checking is a key tool, but it must be part of a toolbox. I cannot emphasize enough, there is no silver bullet against this information. We need to constantly test and invent new solutions.
Okay, we'll talk about each of the tools that you're talking about, because Internews has come up with this set of proposals to better fight disinformation. But speaking of fact-checking initiatives, I think there's also a consciousness more recently coming from news organizations to do fact-checking using the Filipino language. And also, one problem
Absolutely.
is that there's this sustained effort to discredit the mainstream media, meaning the legacy media, the news organizations, established ones, to the point that people don't. there are a good number of people who don't necessarily bother to read the fact checking articles anymore, because once they see that it was published, they automatically say that it's not something to be believed, right? I mean,
It's
how do you deal with
biased and
that? There's a sustained attack on the credibility of the media, and then to the point that they won't even bother to look at the fact checking reports.
Yeah, no, this is a very important question, Christian. And Internews work on a project called the Philippine Fact Checker Incubator, where we work with existing Filipino media, which are going through a mentoring process to then seek accreditation of the International Fact Checking Network and become official fact checkers. And we talk very much with our Filipino media partners, and there is definitely an ongoing reflection, notably after this election cycle, about how to better reach, and notably better reach people the less likely to spontaneously go and read the fact-checking pieces. And that requires, in our view, a few things. One is to reflect about the support. For example, I'm a firm believer that edutainment approaches combining education and entertainment work well, make a product which can be a bit intimidating. A fact-checking pieces can be a bit intimidated for someone who is less media literate or less IT literate. Using tools like edutainment, possibly meme, video, certainly, all that can help new users being reached by fact checking. We should not abandon the idea of fact checking just because the current support of fact checking are not necessarily as efficient as we hoped in reaching the audiences which are the most vulnerable to disinformation. We need to rethink the support, but not necessarily give up on the principle of fact checking.
Okay, let's go to your toolbox. So you said, of course, he has been trying to emphasize to those of you who are watching, listening, there's no silver bullet to deal with this problem, which is very, very grave, even in other countries. But when it comes to this proposed toolbox, what else can we do aside from sustained fact checking?
So aside of or beside fact checking and myth busting, um, and I have to say here that I've been talking a lot about election disinformation, but those tools are important in non-electoral period too. Take the example of COVID-19, around which we have seen a lot of disinformation happening too. So beside fact-checking and myth busting, one key aspect is, for example, media and information literacy. And I would say for each of the tools I will mention, you could imagine a short-term approach and a long-term approach. Let's start with fact-checking. On the short term, we need more media doing fact-checking and quality fact-checking. But on the long term, what we really want is everyone to be a little bit of a fact-checker. First, every journalism students, but every citizen on the longer term. So here you can really combine a short-term approach and a long-term approach. Media and information literacy, same principle. On the short term, it's urgent, it's crucial to reach out to communities in general, all communities, and equip them with the tool to detect with disinformation when they see it, to resist disinformation, to have a critical reading, critical thinking when they're exposed to disinformation. But on the long term, it's clear that we will not make the economy, if we want to to salvage democratic model, we will not make the economy of a reform of educational systems and educational curriculum, integrating the issue of disinformation and critical use of social media. A third tool, I will mention the third and the first one together because for me they are interrelated. There is a question of investigating disinformation and the question of algorithm accountability. What do we mean by investigating disinformation? We simply need to know who is behind disinformation. A lot of work on disinformation is focused on the symptoms of disinformation, on the demand side of disinformation, on the consumers, and it's important to work with the consumers. But we need to be much more proactive in working on the supply side of disinformation. Who are the disinformation spreaders? Are they private? Are they public? Are they domestic? Are they foreign? And they need to be exposed. People need to know who is trying to undermine their democratic model. Essentially, disinformation in an electoral context it's an act of sabotage of a key infrastructure of a democracy, which are elections. It's fundamental rights of the citizens to know who is trying to undermine their democratic models. So therefore, it's important to research constantly the issue of
Mm.
disinformation, because we know very few on who is spreading disinformation, and we need to constantly continue those research efforts. And that leads me to algorithm accountability. Once we have those data, once we find who is spreading disinformation, we need to have a very proactive dialogue with social media platforms about actions they can take, about their responsibilities to take action to tackle disinformation. And that must be a very critical dialogue. I think there are two excesses when it comes to discussing the role of social media in disinformation in the Philippines and elsewhere. One is to consider that social media are entirely responsible to fix the problem. And one is to consider that social media can do anything and should not be bothered with that. I think here, as on many other aspects, we need to reach some middle ground. We need to understand that there are key aspects of this information which cannot be fixed without a proper cooperation with social media platforms. But in the meantime, we cannot rely exclusively on social media platforms to fix that problem. A fifth tool, I have six to propose, if that's okay.
Yeah,
A
go ahead.
fifth
Go ahead.
tool, which is probably the most historic raison d'etre of my organization, Internews, is simply to invest and support fact-based, data-driven, quality journalism. And I would say it's even more essential now after this pandemic, which, to use the work of a famous Filipino journalist, has constituted an extinction event for Filipino media, for the very vivid Filipino media landscape. We need to make sure that media which are doing work consistent with quality standard of journalism, ethical standard of journalism, using data, using fact verification, are given the mean to survive economically and as a model. And there are various ways to do that, which I can explain more in detail if you'd like, but we are exploring a few right now in the Philippines, and some of them are really encouraging.
Go
Just
ahead.
to finish with,
Okay, okay.
yeah, yeah.
Go with the six
Yeah,
first.
to
Okay.
finish with the toolbox, the sixth tool is policy advocacy, and here really in the broad definition of policy. Um, and that's a topic I'm always approaching very carefully, because policy sound awfully close to regulation, and regulation in some environments sound awfully close to censorship. So this is not what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. Every policy advocacy should be done keeping in mind the principles of internet freedom, but there are aspects such as self-regulation of the media sector, media citizen engagement mechanism, media councils, etc., which can be extremely useful in the fight against disinformation. I'm done with
Okay.
my toolbox. Sorry, Christian, I was a bit long.
No, no. I wanted you to finish the presentation regarding the toolbox. But for example, when you talk about the social media platforms, I think based on some of the comments I'm reading here, some are proposing a law that would exact accountability from those who are actually spreading fake information, and perhaps something that can hold the big tech companies more accountable because it's their platform. Those are private companies, but what they do is imbued with public interest, and they are being used to actually propagate lies. We know that, for example, Facebook, Google, YouTube in particular, and even TikTok have come up with certain remedies, but we know that they are not enough, right? What else in concrete terms can be done? What do you think? For example, automatic takedown of posts. We know Facebook has been doing that, but of course we know that as in any fight here in the disinformation war, it always comes late because of the fact that lies spread. Greg,
Sorry,
yeah,
the
did you hear me,
connection was
Greg?
misbehaving a little bit toward the end, but I think I got the
Yeah,
gist.
yeah, yeah. Thanks to
So
Sky
no,
Cable.
yeah.
Thanks to Sky Cable for the
um,
bad internet throughout this program. Okay, go ahead.
um, Look, I mean, I can tell you what I think here, and just to be clear on that, it's I'll express really a personal opinion, but my personal opinion is yes, we won't be able to avoid some sort of common standards through regulation for social media platforms. Now, what I'm deeply convinced about is it should not be at national level, because that would be the open door for censorship. I think we need some international standards applied to all platforms um, to, to make that a level playing field between all the platforms. Also, because if you just apply that at national level, it just will trigger relocation of some platforms and won't change much. But yes, I do believe that on the long term or on the midterm, because it's not long term anymore, given the importance of this crisis, there will need to be a very serious, deep discussion with social media companies about their responsibilities. If you own a bar, if you own a club, and you don't have the proper security at the door, or you don't have an aid kit, and something happened to one of your customers, you're legally responsible.
Yeah, that's
If
true.
you are the owner of a publishing house and you are spreading lies and defaming some political figures, for example, you can be sued. None of that apply to social media platforms, really. And on the other end, they are the biggest club and the biggest publishing house. So I think there is a reflection to have there, which, in my personal view here again, is unavoidable. Now, on the shorter term, one thing I would love to see social media platforms do more. First, I think what they are doing, engaging media organizations, is going in the right direction. But when it comes to the question you mentioned, the algorithm and its role in taking down problematic posts, it's clear by now that the algorithms have huge limits between the disinformation posts, which are not caught by the algorithm, and the non-disinformation posts, which are false positive and are mistakenly caught and taken down by the algorithm. We know that we can't rely exclusively, or even to the current level, which is not exclusive. There is a combination of human monitoring already and algorithm monitoring, but we need much more human monitoring. That's very clear to me, and that's something which we would like to see a more concerted voice, a group of voice, encouraging the social media platforms to do. Higher, higher, higher. You need media, you need the social media monitors, you need human monitors to catch this information on your platforms.
Yeah, that's true. Because, for example, if you talk about the standards used by Facebook, you're basically talking with a computer. You're not
Yeah.
talking with a human person, and that particular entity at the other end of the line, for example, doesn't understand the context within which the disinformation is spreading in your country. Right. So that's the reason why you are proposing more social media monitors
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
basically
and
better understand the context.
you know, I, I, I want to say, because I really feel I need to be fair. Um, I've been talking for some years now with representative of the social media companies, people at country level like us, people based in the Philippines in the current on this case, and I'm actually optimistic because among the staff of social media companies, among the Filipino staff of the social media platforms you have mentioned, there are extremely good willing people who really realize that there is a need to make better, to do better, and are really conscious of their responsibility and trying to move the needle in the right direction in their own companies. They need to be supported. Um, but for that to work, it also means dialogue at much higher levels than we are here, dialogue between governments and social media companies, between international organizations, possibly the UN, and social media companies, with the leadership of social media companies, for them to understand that it is a corporate social responsibility for them to do better on preventing disinformation. We know that social media companies never intended their services to be misused to undermine democratic model. They are not evil, but disinformation operators have found the weaknesses and the gaps in their system and are using and abusing those gaps and weaknesses, those flaws of the algorithm.
Yeah.
They need to fix that.
Yeah. Okay, that's true. That's true. I agree with you in that respect. There's a comment from one of our viewers. We need laws to make them accountable. Basically, the purveyors of disinformation. I think this can also be a dangerous thing, right? Especially in the context of what you said earlier, when you put this at the national level. Because here, for example, a piece of legislation that is crafted under a disinformation regime can actually be used by the very purveyors of disinformation, meaning the state actors, to go after the truth seekers, right? I mean, there are a lot of possible avenues for abuse as well, right?
Yes, I understand the legal temptation, um, And to some extent, I do believe, as I said, that at the international level, we will need to have some sort of regulation when it comes to social media companies themselves. But when it comes to criminalizing disinformation, I think we need to be very careful. I understand the anger, the frustration disinformation operators can trigger. I'm myself very angry and very frustrated when I see people spreading lies without consequences, notably during an election. But as you say, Christian, that can very quickly evolve into very quickly be instrumentalized, utilized for censorship. Remember the case of the Bayanihan Act. The
Yeah.
Bayanihan Act at the beginning of the pandemic had a provision, I think provision 6 or provision 9, I can't remember, criminalizing the spread of fake news about COVID-19. But there was no definition of fake news. And
Yeah.
when you don't define something as vague as this concept, it's pretty much an open door to arrest anyone spreading information you're not happy with. So that's a dangerous and very extreme tool, I would say.
And also the another problem is the gaslighting coming from those who are actually spreading disinformation, because I don't know whether people are realizing it now lately. The so-called purveyors of disinformation are claiming to fact check the fact checkers. I
Yeah,
mean, they're trying to
I've seen
destroy
that
the
one.
facts. I mean, you've seen that, right? They're they're all over the place. So I mean, how do you deal with a problem that mutates by the second? I mean, there are a lot of avenues for them to spread their lies, and I don't think we have sufficient imagination as we speak to be able to deal with those problems, right? But here, there's a question coming from another viewer. Any international examples where individuals or groups who spread disinformation were made accountable?
Yes, plenty, but mostly I would say in not necessarily as democratic political environment as the Philippines. There are plenty of countries where there are some degree of criminalization of the spread of disinformation. Again, I think we can look. We can have a comparative study of legal frameworks, and actually, that's a very interesting research project we should consider having. Um, but what really is the concern for me is the definition of the concept of disinformation, the definition of what is fake news. If that would be an easy definition, we will not be where we are today, struggling with this problem as we are. It is a very vague concept, and this is where I do believe in a more educational and less sanction-based approach. If we give the tool to citizens for critical thinking, for critical reading, if we put the data and the facts at the center of the dialogue about what is information, what are news, if we teach the users to make the difference between an opinion piece, which is extremely important, but different of an investigative fact-based piece, for example, we probably are going to have a greater impact than by criminalizing and face much less risk to see a leader we disagree with using that piece of law against a journalist doing his work, for example, or
Okay.
work.
Now, of course, in terms of developing the critical thinking of the people, of the public, of the citizenry, you would need schools to be able to do that, right? The effective teaching tools as well as media, right? Now, in terms of developing that kind of critical thinking to distinguish between fake news and truthful information, how early should schools start? And
As early
are
as
there best
possible.
practices in other countries that can be adopted here?
As early as possible. No doubt on
As early as
that.
possible.
Yeah, and certainly not waiting for university or for dealing with young adults. But in general, I also think that more generally we need to introduce political science in school curricula at a very early stage. What used to be called civic education is still called civic education in some countries, in some educational curriculum. We need to young people are politicized at a very early stage nowadays, and I think it's important to give them the tool to understand politics, to understand how government works, to even expose them concretely to that. We could imagine that school visits in government institutions, observation of parliamentarian session, for example. It's really, and of course, dialogue and understanding of how social media or algorithm work. All that should be done as early as possible. I mean, kids are accessing outlets and social media platforms at a very early age now. But to reply your previous point, Christian, yes, definitely media and information literacy, critical thinking needs to go through formal education, but there are other ways on shorter term to re-inoculate some critical thinking in the citizenry through media and information literacy campaigns, which do not necessarily need to go through the formal education curriculum. I really say we need both. On the short term, we need media and information literacy, helping people to better understand how the social media they are using works, why they essentially seeing one type of news in their information feeds, these kind of things. And then we need to invest on future generations, and that will take 1 or 2 generations probably to go there. So we really need both because we do not have the luxury of the time anymore when it comes to combating disinformation. It's an emergency.
And by the way, does your group have any program for trainers to be able to teach children in the formal education sector
We
on
do
how
not.
to spot fake news?
In the Philippines, we do not work yet, and I hope that will change one day with formal education. We do have several media and information literacy campaigns implemented with our Filipino partners. We have Community Online Barangay Hub, which is kind of coordinating those media and information literacy efforts. We are encouraging greater dialogue between citizens and their media. We have supported media citizen engagement councils or mechanisms such as the Cordillera Media Citizen Council, which was created in December. We have an information tipping platform for citizens, also called Barangay Hub. That's a reporting tool for citizens to share with their community media the information they'd like to see covered. And we also have a tool, totooba.info, which allows citizens to report this information directly to Internews so that we can process those data and discuss those findings with social media platforms. But at this stage, unfortunately, we do not have a formal partnership with formal education institutions in the
Okay,
Philippines.
we're nearing the end of our program, and I'd like to read a couple of questions and comments. I think they're very relevant. First, this one, I think this is a valid concern. How much did the long lockdowns or the pandemic lockdowns affect the spread of disinformation?
And yeah, another very good question from your audience. In our assessment, considerably, the exposition of Filipinos and of everyone worldwide, for that matters, to social media as a quasi-exclusive source of information was amplified by the lockdowns and by the pandemic and the various forms of quarantines globally. In addition, people, as we all know, we were all in that situation. We were all looking for information on the pandemic, trying to figure out when the lockdown will end, trying to figure out if there was the beginning of a solution. And people were going naturally towards social media for that, particularly when they were locked down. And of course, there was a lot of disinformation specifically about the pandemic and later on about the vaccines circulated on social media too. So this is really a very good question because this pandemic has been both worsening the phenomenon of disinformation and weakening democratic models for plenty of reasons. And one of them is that it's very difficult to organize elections in the context of a pandemic. So it has been too rough year for defenders of democratic models. Yeah.
How about the troll farms or the so-called line troll networks? What would be an effective approach against them?
Here, I think I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation that disinformation is an umbrella concept, but in reality, it covers so many different realities. And even the concept of troll farms cover different reality. Are we talking about a team of campaign activists contracted in the Philippines to spread disinformation for one candidate? Are we talking about a troll farm based in a foreign country and spreading disinformation? Depending on what we're talking about, the solutions will be very different. When it comes to foreign influence, my perspective on this is that um, it's really a very serious international action to support disinformation in another country and should lead to consequences. It's again, for me, akin to an act of sabotage against essential infrastructure, as there is no doubt that elections are essential infrastructure. When it comes to domestic disinformation and domestic troll farms, it is much more complicated and much more blurred line between a regular campaign strategy team and a troll farm. Um, but again, I don't know if there are any other solutions outside of the toolbox I mentioned there, and I'm really open to suggestions there. But we need to work on both the supply and the demand side. On the supply side, we need to work with social media platforms so that they can take down toxic operators. On the demand side, we need to help the citizenry be better protect against disinformation operations. There is no way around. It has to be on both sides. It cannot be tackled from one angle only.
Okay, Greg, I hope you don't mind that, but a few more questions came in,
No,
and I
absolutely.
think
It's
they're very
fascinating.
relevant. You don't mind? You don't have
Absolutely. No, no, I really enjoy it.
Okay, we'll stay here until 12 midnight. No, I'm joking. Okay, this one, there's a question here. I think this is very relevant. How can we as ordinary Filipinos help fight disinformation?
Plenty of ways. One is to report disinformation when you see it. I tend to see that as a citizen duty. Report it using the tools of the social media platforms themselves, but also tools such as the one I mentioned, totooba.info, the platform of Internews. I can assure you that those data are not just kept there and lying dormant. We report those data regularly to social media platforms, ask them to take actions after having verified, of course, that disinformation is actually disinformation. So that's one way to do that. Um, I think another way is really to dialogue. I really think that disinformation goes hand in hand with polarization of societies in modern democracies, and we need to keep the dialogue open. We cannot stigmatize people who fall victim of disinformation. We all have people falling victim of disinformation in our families. I'm sure none of us here does not have at least one uncle, one cousin, one parent um, who is driving us mad because he's just repeating that conspiracy theory that he or she has read online. We need to keep a dialogue open. We need to keep those people accessing better sources of information. We need to keep in mind that they are not the culprits. They are the victims of disinformation operations. Yes, they can be utilized to spread further that disinformation, but they are first and foremost victims because they have been deprived of a fundamental right every citizen should have, which is to have access to quality information. So we need to approach them first and foremost as victim of disinformation. Another way is to support media and information literacy, spread the good word about the importance of critical thinking, the importance of critical reading. Um, Help your media when you can. We all have our favorite media. We all know that no media is absolutely perfect, but we need to learn to make the difference between clickbait, hate spreading pages, and journalists adhering to best practices and ethical standards, and we need to support them. And one of the way to do that is just to buy newspapers or to buy subscriptions. So there are plenty of ways where at our levels as citizens we can help the work against disinformation.
Okay, this one. If the disinformation continues in the next few decades, what will be the long-term impact of this? And I think a related question is, do you see a tipping point for disinformation, or is this something we have to deal with indefinitely, or perhaps for the rest of our lives?
I think disinformation, a bit like global warming, is a calm down, and that if we do not act quickly, it will be too late eventually. Uh, Recent study by the organization International IDEA showed that 70% of the population in 2022 live under either an undemocratic regime or a backsliding democracy, a democracy becoming more authoritarian. And this deterioration of democracy is not a new phenomenon. It is something which has been worsening over at least the past 2 years, and depending on which data you look at, the past 5 years. So democracies are losing ground, and I would say democracies are under attack by authoritarian regimes, by disinformation spreaders, by people who have not the best interest of the population of our countries at heart. So there is an urgency. There is and I genuinely do believe that if not much more is done against disinformation in the coming years, it will eventually be too late. So that's one thing we try to do at our very small, humble level at Internews, is really to raise awareness in the international community about the importance of this phenomenon and the risk it represents for democracies. And Christian and I were not so long ago given the opportunity to brief a few representatives of the international community of the situation in the Philippines. And I think this is the kind of thing we need to keep doing. This is a crucial time, and this is a vital moment for democracies.
Greg, Kaelia, thank you for those thoughts, those information that you just shared with us. Our viewers are very happy with your with your answers, with your perspectives, and we're very grateful that you decided to join us tonight. It has been a very
Thanks, Paul.
fruitful discussion, but more importantly, I hope this could help not exactly solve the problem. Of course, that would be the goal, right? But at least minimize the spread of disinformation in the immediate term. Thank you very much, Greg, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to your audience for fascinating questions. Thank you so much.
We'll stay in touch because this is a continuing battle that needs the support and contributions from all stakeholders, not just Internews, not just the journalists. But thank you, Greg.
Look forward to that, Christian. Have a good evening, everyone.
Yeah.